So welcome back to the Book of Ruth, Session 4, An Outsider's Welcome. When we left our story last session, Naomi and Ruth had just returned to Bethlehem, and they had arrived according to the narrator's announcement at the beginning of the barley harvest. And this is something that's really interesting about this book, and if you have any sort of background in agriculture, the time sequences are not being announced by month or by day or even by season. They're being announced around the crops that are being grown, the vegetables that are being brought in, and this really is a field laborer's perspective. So when Naomi comes home, 10 long years after she left, life has changed radically. She has gone out full, as she announced, with tears streaming down her face, and she's come back empty. Elimelech, the boys, they're gone, and at this point she has standing behind her perhaps the most faithful kinswoman anyone could ever ask for, but a kinswoman who has been identified already by her circle of village friends and by everybody else in this book as the Moabitess. We might as well fill in the blank with the outsider. So, as we take a look at the concluding lines of the last chapter, Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So let's talk about barley for a minute. Everything you ever wanted to know about the barley harvest in Israel. What do we know? Well, we have a certain piece, an inscription, an artifact that is critical actually to the discussion of the agricultural cycles in Israel. How much fun is this? You're looking at an image right now of something called the Gezer calendar. This one actually was taken by Lawson Stone, who is a professor at Asbury Theological, and it's a practice tablet on the part of probably a school child, and you can tell that it's a school child who's learning his letters because it's so messy. And on top of that, he put his name on his assignment. You see there in the little circle, his name is Avi, which for generations has been a nickname for Avraham. So what is Avi busy writing up for his 5th grade teacher as he practices his penmanship? Well, he's writing up a classic poem, sort of almost recitation of these agricultural cycles in Israel. And so as you look at the translation, what does it say? His 2 months are the olive harvest. His 2 months are the planting of grain. His 2 months are late sowing. His month is cutting flax. His month is harvesting barley. His month is harvesting or finishing the feasting. His 2 months are vine pruning, and his month is summer fruit. Love, Avi. Okay, I put the love part in. So what you're looking at here is in the Israelite agricultural cycle, the grains are planted actually in early winter, late fall, early winter. They grow throughout the winter, which is the rainy season, and hopefully we'll have an early rain and a late rain to finish up the harvest. And the barley harvest actually begins in late April. It'll take about 2 weeks to get the barley in, and then the wheat harvest will begin. And this will become important as we move through this story. Because as you remember, Ruth started working in Boaz's fields at the beginning of the barley harvest, and he's going to like her work so much, he's going to ask her to stay through the wheat harvest. In other words, by the time we get to our great denouement at dawn, it has been nearly 6 weeks that Ruth has been working in the fields of Boaz. Okay, how does grain harvest work in ancient Israel? Well, we don't have tractors and silos and irrigation machines. This is all very high labor effort. We're going to plow the field actually with an oxen or with a mule. There's going to be a wooden plow that moves behind, and hopefully a plow share that's actually made of iron. Iron is very rare and very expensive, and that will break up the soil. Then we're going to plant seed actually by hand casting, and the seed's going to be spread throughout the field. And then when it comes to fruition, our laborers are going to go out with a sieve, which is probably going to be lined with flint. It's a curved weapon, it can be a weapon, where the menfolk go through and they cut down the barley. They leave it in the field for a period of days so that it can dry out. And then either men or women come back and bundle it up. They let it dry a little bit longer because it weighs a lot more when it's still full of moisture. And when it's fully dry, it's much easier to bring in. Women typically are the ones that bring the grain in, and then it's all brought to the threshing floor. And the threshing floor is an important area of community gathering in any ancient subsistent culture, but especially in Israel. Typically, a village is only going to have one, just one, because it takes so much labor to prepare a threshing floor. First of all, it has to be on an elevated site. Then the dirt and vegetation has to be taken down to bedrock. You can't do threshing on dirt, or you're going to wind up with a lot of dirt in your grain. And although I've actually excavated skeletons where you can see that their teeth have been ground down to almost nothing because of the amount of dirt in their grain, the goal, of course, is to keep the dirt out of the grain. So it's going to be ground down to bedrock. It's going to be a large, round area. And there's going to be one threshing floor per village. It's going to be outside the village, which is going to be important to us as the story moves forward. And this threshing floor becomes the focus of the harvest, the focus of the celebration after the harvest, and the focus of a great deal of labor. The image that you're looking at right now has piled the sheaves. You think about some of those old hymns, bringing in the sheaves. They've piled the sheaves on the outside circle of the threshing floor. You've got 2 oxen under a yoke who are dragging a threshing sledge around and around and around. This can take 2 or 3 days. And each of those bovines, I've actually done the work. I know it's crazy. They weigh between 600 and 800 pounds. These are big animals. And do you remember that little law in Deuteronomy? Do not muzzle the ox while he threshes the grain. I've actually demonstrated in a particular article how much an ox can consume in a day of threshing. And if you're living in a subsistence economy, the fact that that 800-pound bovine is taking in 6 to 8 quarts of grain a day makes a difference. And yet the God of Israel says, in this economy, where they know they're going to come up short at the end of the season, don't you muzzle that ox. Yes, he's working, and he's working hard for you. Let him enjoy his life and work. I kind of like that about our God. So the oxen are dragging the sledge. The sledge becomes kind of a toy at this point in time because the kids get to ride on top of it to keep the weight down. And as they grind and grind and grind, the grain is separated from the sheaves, and the grain is piled in the middle and becomes just about the most precious item in an Israelite household. This is the backbone of their food source. This is how they feed their animals. This is how they feed themselves. Barley, our first harvest, is the grain that we use for livestock and for the impoverished. Think about that the next time you read the book of Hosea, and he bids 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. He's a poor man. Wheat, on the other hand, is the grain that we feed to the elite. And wheat is the grain for the human that's making it. All right, so this is an image of a threshing floor. I actually took this one. And what you're looking at now is ancient and unused, but you get the idea of the flat bedrock and the surrounding wall around. The surrounding wall is to keep the grain inside because it's so precious. Here you're looking at an image of an actual threshing sledge. And a threshing sledge would have bits of rock and iron embedded in it, so as it was dragged and dragged, it would separate those sheaves from the grain. The next step is after you've separated the grain, you're going to winnow it. This is one of those words you bump into in old books and you actually have no idea what it means, right? So winnowing is when someone takes a pitchfork and takes that grain, which is pretty much separated, and throws it in the air, and the wind comes through and blows away the chaff. Here's another metaphor that we live with, right? And the chaff blows away, and the grain is just heavy enough that it drops down to the earth. And so now you've got your grain, and you wash it, and you store it, and you hope you have enough until next spring. You're looking at some images of past students of mine. Sarah Holliday is holding one of the essential tools of a grain-based culture. This is a grinding stone, and women would spend 2, 3, 6 hours a day grinding grain into flour to provide for their households. Over there is Jason Jackson, who is holding a storage pot that we discovered at Tel Rehov, 10th century. That means this pot actually comes from David's era. And oh, how excited we are to pull this pot out of the ground, but how much more excited we were when they started emptying it and realized it was full of barley. Yes, barley, which is a great carbon-14 dating tool because barley only exists for a short period of time. So yeah, Jason almost gave himself a hernia getting that pot out of the ground, but no one was going to touch that pot but him. And you're looking at me over on the side as dirty as you'll ever see me. Okay. Oh, and one more image. This is my sweet little girl. She's now a big girl, finding her very own cooking pot, which is what you're doing next after you bring in all of your grain. Okay, so this is everything you ever wanted to know about harvesting grain in ancient Israel. Let's get back to our story. We're in Ruth chapter 2. And Ruth chapter 2 actually starts with something that I, as a Hebrew teacher, would call a circumstantial clause. It's marked by two disjunctive vavs. If I have any past students in the audience, you have got to explain to your group the difference between a conjunctive and a disjunctive clause. What that means is the narrator has given us an aside. This is a meanwhile back in the bat cave kind of statement. And the meanwhile back in the bat cave statement is this. Now, by the way, reader, Ruth and Naomi don't know this yet, but Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech. And you're all now experts in tribal culture, and you know why that's important. Because if he's a kinsman, he might have the responsibility of redemption. A man of standing. Here's our statement, a gibor chayil. You've learned the word chayil. What does it mean? It means a man of character, a man of strength, a man of wealth. It could even mean a retired military man. It's possible. We could be looking at The Sound of Music here as we evolve with Captain Von Trapp. Let's see. He is a gibor chayil, whose name was Boaz. By the way, the word Boaz means strength. So our characters are well named, are they not? End circumstantial clause. Jump back into the story. Now Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." The deal is that neither Naomi nor Ruth have any means of supporting themselves. And so as widows in this ancient tribal culture, the only opportunity they have in front of them is to make use of the gleaning laws in ancient Israel. And the gleaning laws in ancient Israel actually come out of Deuteronomy, which is the constitution and bylaws of this nation, and they are compelled by their law to make space for the widow and the orphan. Let me read it to you. When you, O farmer who is trying to make a living, reap your harvest in your field, and you realize that you have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. That is not my Protestant work ethic. I don't know about you. If I've forgotten a sheaf in the field and I'm busy trying to make my budget, the first thing I do is I find a flashlight and I get out there and I find that sheaf in the field. You will not go back to get it. Rather, leave it there for the foreigner, for the orphan, and for the widow, in order that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat out your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the foreigner, for the orphan, for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go out over it again. It shall be for the foreigner, for the orphan, and for the widow. Why? Verse 22, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this thing. In other words, you know what it means to be hungry. You know how it feels to live in your car. You know what it looks like not to know how in the world you're going to get the electric bill paid. Have compassion. Yes, you could make an extra $20. Yes, you could make an extra $200. Leave it out there and let somebody else get what they need. These are the gleaning laws, and this is what Ruth takes advantage of. And so she goes out, and we're going to anticipate that she heads out before dawn. And we're going to anticipate that she is clothed modestly, as any woman in this culture would be, and especially as a young widow would be, and she's going to wander from field to field, looking for an opportunity to follow the harvesters, far enough back that nobody feels that she's impinging on their work, and far enough back that she doesn't get herself into trouble. Talk about the scariest moment of your first day of middle school. Yeah? A total outsider. So she went out and she began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who, by the way, was from the clan of Elimelech. And just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. And Boaz, the CEO, who could have stayed home in his air-conditioned office, instead actually heads out to the fields. And when he heads out to the fields, he greets them from his cart, "Yahweh be with you," which, by the way, is pretty elevated speech. This is a God bless you kind of moment. "Yahweh bless you," they called back. And Boaz turned to the foreman of his harvesters, and he said, "Whose young woman is that?" Well, there are several things I like about Boaz in this passage. One, he knows who his God is. He names him. This is not a generic reference to God, whoever he may be. "May Yahweh be with you," he says. He treats his employees, even though they're out in the field, essentially sharecroppers, with dignity and with respect. He does not ignore their existence. He sees them and he greets them. He brings the integrity born of his faith into his workplace. I like that. And number 4, he actually knows who works for him. All right, think of a foreman who steps out onto the floor of a factory, and there are 6,000 shoes going by, and there are 8,000 workers crowding the noisy room. And Boaz looks at all these workers lining the assemblies, and he says, "Who's that one?" He actually knows who works for him. And when he knows who works for him, he sees the outsider. I would say that that is probably the greatest challenge of true Christian hospitality. First, you have to see that someone needs hospitality, and then you have to offer it. Okay, so the story goes on. The foreman replies. He says, "She is the Moabitess." The girl doesn't even have a name. Who came back from Moab with Naomi. Oh, Naomi's got a name. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She went into the field and has worked steadily from the morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now, pause over Ruth's experience so far. What do you think Ruth's experience as a manual laborer in the Israelite sun is up until this point? She's headed out before dawn. I can tell you from many years of experience that heading out before dawn to do manual labor in Israel is actually quite pleasant. It's kind of cool. You might even need a long sleeve shirt, because when we do archaeology, we leave at 4:30, maybe at 5, depending on your senior excavator. And you get out there and you set up the shade cloths and you get out the equipment, and it's kind of pleasant. Yeah. By 7 o'clock, not too bad. 8 o'clock, it's starting to heat up. 9 o'clock, you're starting to find excuses to stay under the shade cloth. By 11 o'clock, you are exercising your professorial authority to make the poor student who came with you take the wheelbarrow out to the dump site because you don't want to leave that shade cloth. This woman has been out in the field since before dawn. She's covered from head to foot in probably wool clothing, because that's what the Israelites wore. She's probably in black because she's a widow. And how much lunch do you think Ruth brought with her? I don't know if she even has any lunch. How much water can one woman carry? I can tell you when I dig, we go through liter after liter after liter of water, and I visit the Jiffy Johns very rarely for more than one reason. I hate the Jiffy Johns, but 2, you're sweating it all out, so you don't even need to visit those foul constructions. So this is Ruth's experience. And I can tell you, by the time lunch rolls around, this young woman has sweat running between her shoulder blades. I can anticipate that her stomach has been turning over for an hour or two and there's nothing to fill it. And I can anticipate that she's starting to even perhaps dehydrate. And yet this woman has worked steadily from the morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz spoke to Ruth. Okay, guys, how many CEOs seek out that one foreign person on the factory assembly line? How many factory farming execs head out to see which sharecroppers showed up today to take care of the harvesting of the strawberry fields in California? I'm just asking. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter," he treats her with dignity, "listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls." So that lets us know that there are other women out on the field, and he's recognizing that if she hangs with the rest of the women, she's in better shape than if she's bumping into the male workers. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. Now this is Israel, right? These are God's people, right? These men just yelled back, "And Yahweh be with you." They know who they work for, and he has to tell them, don't touch her. She's an outsider, she's a foreigner, yeah, she's a Moabite, but that doesn't mean she's one of them. It doesn't mean you're free to grab her. It doesn't mean you're free to mock her. This is not a construction site. Catcalling is not okay. Leave her alone. All right, I'm liking Boaz better every moment. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. Now, having read the site reports on Bethlehem, I can tell you that there is no perennial water source in Bethlehem. There's no spring, there's no river. In fact, Bethlehem collects its water in cisterns, which is, basically a large underground storage tank. And don't be thinking that a cistern is the size of your bathtub. Don't even be thinking a cistern is the size of your cistern if you happen to be out in the country. A cistern in Israel is as big as this studio, and sometimes bigger. So Bethlehem has got numerous underground cisterns. They're collecting the water, but the only way water gets out to the field is in large jars, like the image you're looking at in front of you. Collard-rimmed storage jars would be a standard means. These jars will have cone-shaped bottoms, and they will be one strapped on to either side of a donkey. And the donkey will be led out. Have you ever had a donkey? They move real fast. Oh, yeah. And they're very eager to work, donkeys. Oh, yeah. And they will be led all the way out to the field to make sure that the men who are doing the heavy labor work don't dehydrate. But a guy like Boaz is making sure that the women don't dehydrate. In fact, he's even making sure that the sharecropper girl doesn't dehydrate. So when you want a drink, come to the jars. Come right up here and get the water that you need. At this, Ruth bowed down with her face to the ground. Act of complete humility. And she exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes?" Do you remember what she said in the first line? I'm going to go out in the fields and see if I can find favor. Literally, the word is grace. If I can find grace. Why have I found such grace in your eyes? That you notice me. There's that first step, right? Literally, it says recognize me. You saw me. You see me here, a foreigner. And Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know. Boaz realizes that Ruth didn't have to do this. Boaz knows the law of his land, and he knows that Ruth has shown extraordinary character in abandoning her own home, her own family, her own potential resources to follow Naomi. I know what you've done. Verse 12, may Yahweh, he names his God. Now, the Moabites have their own God, and there's also a generic kind of idea of God, and this is a polytheistic world. Boaz names his God. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by Yahweh, the God of Israel. Boaz is reaching out with Yahweh hospitality, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Okay, I love that line. And I love that line for so many reasons, but one of them is because he sees a young woman who, in our culture, might be identified as an illegal immigrant, who has come to do manual labor in the field. And he does not see her as an imposition. He does not see her as an unwanted inconvenience. He does not see that person who's wandered into the very back row of your church reeking of cigarettes with 3 children who are so incredibly misbehaved that they've disrupted the entire sermon as a difficulty. He looks at this young woman and he sees someone seeking refuge under the wings of his God. Under whose wings you've come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You've given me comfort, and you've spoken kindly to your servant. Perhaps I'm overly nostalgic here, but I wonder who in that town has spoken kindly to Ruth up until this point. I'm going to anticipate a lot of active ignoring. You know how that works? You know, when people are fully aware that this young woman has stepped into the marketplace, and they are kind of not looking, not talking, not making eye contact. That's what I'm going to anticipate has been a lot of Ruth's experience. You've spoken kindly to me. You've given me comfort to your servant, though I don't even have the standing of one of your servant girls. Okay, our Ruth is humble. Our Ruth is willing to bow her face to the ground. I'm liking my Ruth. I'm liking my Boaz. These are good people. And so the day continues until lunchtime rolls around. And again, if you've ever excavated, mealtime is, it doesn't matter if all you've got is boiled eggs and a couple of avocados. It is the moment. Oh, yeah. At mealtime, Boaz said to her. Now, before we read what he says to her, let me tell you what mealtime's going to look like. There's going to be a shelter of some sort. Either a rough temporary shelter with palm branches thrown on top to create shade, or in our case, there would be shade cloth thrown up over some tent poles. That whole business of getting out of the sun is huge. It's huge. And so in the shelter, these people are having lunch. And the lunch has been brought in from town, probably on carts. And for the first time, everybody gets to put down their work. And these are hard-working people, all right, that just across the board. Everybody has pushed it to the limit. And in one of the rare occurrences in this particular culture, the men and the women sit down together. The young men and the young women sit down together. Okay, this is a culture where marriages get arranged, where flirting really isn't tolerated, and young women and young men do not get much time eyeball to eyeball. But this is one of those times. So you can expect a lot of laughter, some giggling, some jockeying for position, who's going to sit next to who. Can I find an excuse to actually be forced to sit next to him? Yeah, maybe. This is what's going on under the shelter. And at mealtime, Boaz says to Ruth, who, if she's got anything in her pocket, is sitting over on the side of the field trying to find one little spot of shade by herself. And he says, come near, come here, come to the shelter. Come in with the crowd. Have some bread. Dip it in the wine vinegar. And when she sat down with the harvesters, did you go to middle school? Did anyone ever make you sit at the popular kids' table? What do the popular kids do when the geek comes? They scoot over and they actively ignore. I'm going to guess that might be the first experience. You sit down. And he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all she wanted, and she had some left over. I'm going to wonder when the last time was that Ruth had some left over. And as she got up to glean again, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. That means no catcalls. Rather, pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and do not rebuke her. The word embarrass in Hebrew is actually plunder. Don't plunder her. Don't rebuke her. What sort of embarrassment or rebuke might happen in a scenario like this? Yeah, we know. And how many times does Boaz have to tell his young men to leave her alone? This is the third. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Guys, an ephah is 40 liters of grain. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. And Ruth also brought out and gave to Naomi what she had left over from lunch after she had eaten enough. Now, another thing that I love about our Ruth here is that Naomi would have had no idea that Ruth had leftover lunch. And yet Ruth has treasured it, saved it in her pocket to give it to her mother-in-law, who she knows is hungry as well. So much, Naomi exclaims. Where did you gather all this grain today? Where did you work? May Yahweh bless the one who helped you. And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. Boaz! Yahweh bless him, Naomi said to her. He's not stopped showing his kindness, his chesed, to the living or to the dead. And she added, that man, he's our close relative. He's one of the men who might be able to redeem us. And then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay with his workers until they finish harvesting all of the grain. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. Even Naomi knows the risk. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, guys, this brings us to the end of this session. I have got some launch questions for you. At this point, your little group gets to choose one of three. Ready? What is it about exclusion that makes the in crowd feel better about itself? Question one. Question two, do any of your members have a personal story about having been the outsider and having the insider step up and defend you? Or try question three, a story about being the insider and stepping up to defend the outsider. What did it cost you?